So actually, the first thing is we want to understand what is e-invoice, because a lot of people they are understanding e-invoice as long you provide the PDF files, you're giving a soft copy of the invoice to your clients, or you send the email to indicate that how much you're owing me, and then there's an invoice attached. They call it e-invoice. But in Malaysia, the practice e-invoice is slightly different with others. That one we call it is a soft copy invoice. But e-invoice, it consists of four components. The first thing is digital representing of the transaction between the buyer and the seller. This one is like a normal invoice. Their practice still remain the same. The second is replace the traditional paper and electronic documents. So-called electronic documents is referred like the previous, like we just now mentioned, the PDF invoice, or you get JPEG, the invoice. That one is no longer, that one is still considered as electronic, or we call it a soft copy invoice, but it's not e-invoice. E-invoice, it consists one component very important, is the validation from the IRB software. IRB, that side, they will do the validations, which means your record, when you issue the invoice, IRB will know that how much is your sales, and then how many the quantity you already been selling off. So that is the thing different between the old soft copy invoice and the latest, the e-invoice. And then the fourth item is regarding the safeguard on the data. So the data later we were talking about the 55 components inside the e-invoice. So in the e-invoice transactions, there is a four type of documents we are using. Same things. First is calling the invoice. It's described regarding the transaction from the buyer and the seller. So this is the proof of the transactions in between. Second, for the debit note. Debit note is using to increase or indicate the additional charges on the previous invoice issue. This document is very important you need to remember. Before e-invoice new era, a lot of the company are practicing using debit note to collect payments. But after e-invoice implementation, no longer can be practiced that. Because the debit note will be used to indicate the invoice to additional charges. That is, we call it the debit notes. The third one is a credit note. Credit note, it will be issued is when there is a error, or you're going to give a special discount, or you have a mistake in the previous invoice to do the adjustment. But credit note is didn't involve for the refund payments. If you giving a discount and you're going to refund a money back to your clients, that one we call it a refund note. So there is a 4-item documents in the e-invoice new era. So you need to remember these 4 type of documents, and then in future when you're practicing, most of the time you'll be using an invoice. And then debit note no longer can be used to collect payments or related party charges, those things. Because debit note also will be affected your revenue. Because invoice will be used to proof of income. Credit note is due to the adjustment to reduce the amount of the previous invoice you already been issued. Refund note, same things, but it have additional criteria is when you're going to give a refund to your clients, then you're going to practice a refund note. So over here, we are talking about the e-invoice. E-invoice is most important document in the e-invoice new era. Because first thing, e-invoice is going to use to proof of income. If you have an income, you didn't issue the e-invoice, it consider wrongdoing. Same thing, you don't issue the e-invoice, you cannot recognize your income. So in future, if you are doing a business, you need to have an e-invoice to justify your income. Second thing, you also need to request for the e-invoice to proof of your expenses. If people didn't give you an e-invoice, then you need to request the supplier or service provider to issue you an e-invoice, because the e-invoice is to justify and proof of your expenses. Without an e-invoice, the expenses is not allowed for tax deduction. So e-invoice also going to be used for the tax purpose. This is the main purpose of the e-invoice. We're looking at the documents. E-invoice only will have 2 types. They call it the XML format. Another one is called JSON. These two, when you prepare, actually there's a empty template. You'll be send the data to the IB system, then later they validate, come back to you. That is only we call it the e-invoice. Otherwise, the generation in your software or you prepare the soft copy under the Excel, that one the invoice is not calling e-invoice. E-invoice later I will explain using what two model. One is you're going to use the API model. Another one is my invoice portal. So if for those don't have the accounting software, you are allowed to using a my invoice portal. And then you look at the bottom, the e-invoice. Like for example, the PDF folder, the doc folder, the JPG, those is not considered as an e-invoice. This thing you need to remember. So when people giving you the PDF file, say that, oh, I give you the e-invoice, it doesn't mean you receive the e-invoice. Because you need to go back to the e-invoice portal, the my invoice portal, to look back, is that you receive the e-invoice or not? Because sometimes people give you the PDF format of the invoice, it just show you that it's a normal invoice. It's not considered as an e-invoice. E-invoice, they'll be send you a notification, ask you to confirm, is that the invoice correct or not? If the invoice is wrong, then you can do the rejects. If invoice is correct, you just accept the invoice. So this is the document you're going to have. Later, you also need to remember, like for those not doing business, most of the time we will be claimed for the tax relief when you're doing a personal tax return. So coming in 2025, July, 1st July, all the expenses relate to the tax relief. For example, your insurance statement, going to buy a computer, you're going to buy a handphone, electronic items, sport equipment, you need to remember to request e-invoice. That one is going to prove there is a expenses incurred by you and going for the tax relief claim purpose. So which means the e-invoice will be support for the proof of expenses and also for the tax purpose. This is the thing you need to be take care. So now I'm giving you an example. So for example, over here, supplier 1, they sold 200 units of the office chair to the buyer. So when they sold it out to the buyer, supplier will be issued an e-invoice because supplier want to prove their income, the 200 unit of the chair. So the buyer also same things, they need the e-invoice proof for their expenses for the tax purpose. So this transactions is calling complete when the e-invoice is issued. But when the buyer receives the item, they find out 8 of the chair got the 40 or got damaged, they're going to return back. So there is a 2 documents going to be prepared by the supplier. One either go for the credit note, another one possible is going using a refund note. So in what circumstances you're going to use a credit note is there is no money refunds. So supplier 1, when they receive 8 units of the office chair returns, they'll be prepared a credit note to the buyer. Okay, there's 8 units, I issue a credit note. This one is just the credit note just used to reduce the previous income of the 200 pieces of the office chair. There is no involved of the money returns because supplier thinks that coming soon, I will be replaced another 8 units to you. I issue you a invoice, the e-invoice for the balance 8 units when they're going to replace to the buyer. So there is not involved the money refunds to the buyer. So if the transaction involve the returns of the money to the 8 units, first thing, supplier same things, they will be issue the e-invoice to the buyer for the 200 unit share. And then buyer will make the 200 payments of the office share. When there is an involved of monetaries, then they found the 8 units got problem, got damage, got 40s. There's a return back to the supplier. In this scenario, buyer, they want the money back first. They want to collect money back first. They don't want to wait for the 8-unit replacement with the e-invoice. So in this scenario, supplier is required to prepare a refund note. So this refund note is to prove of the expenses reduced on the buyer. So together with the money going to pay back to buyer. So there's a difference between the credit note and the refund notes. Credit note didn't involve for the money for the repayments. Refund note is when you reduce your revenue income, same things you're going to pay back the money to the buyer. So there's the two different practice on the refund note and credit notes. This one you need to be take care, because a lot of times people thought that I just issue a credit notes, but they didn't aware that issue credit note is not involved the money repayments. So when suppose they have to issue is a refund note. That's the thing's difference. Okay, we look at the type of transactions. There's usually three nature in the markets. Most of the time is B2B, business to business. For example, Shajida to yours agents. So first thing, you need to understand, are you doing business or not? Because agent can be two types. I can run as an individual, I'm running as agents, but I'm not doing business. So that one is B2C already. It's an end user. So another type is like I'm set up a sole proprietor, or I set up a trading company. I set up an enterprise. Then that one is a B2B. When the transaction involves B2B, it's a must using e-invoice. All the transaction of the income, or you're going to purchase of the purchase of expenses incurred, you also involve the e-invoice. This one you cannot be escaped. So we go for B2C. B2C is depend on the consumer. If the consumer requests the e-invoice, the company is required to provide it. You can provide it immediate, you can provide it later. So that is the arrangement between you and customer already. So when the transaction involves B2C, first thing, most of the time you are continue using a normal invoice. The handwriting invoice, you can still using accounting software to generate the normal invoice. That one still acceptable, but if your customer is requesting the e-invoice, you need to be able to provide to them. That is we call it B2C. B2G, business to government. Same things. B2G, the company is required to issue e-invoice to all the government. So that is a very important part you need to take care. It's actually similar to the B2B. Then one question. Is it possible G2B, government issue you invoice or government have a transaction with you on the business? Can you share, is there any possibility the government will have a transaction with yours? Okay, government with yours, most of the time you'll be facing like you're going to hospital, the government hospital, they'll be issue you a receipt. So later I will show you the transaction, how it works. So that is a possible G2B. So is there a require for the invoice, e-invoice? Then we will be explain later. Then how about C2B? Consumer to the business, or consumer to the agents, or consumer to the IO Raya or Shajida. Is that possible? C2B. So maybe yours can share later on the charts. For those C2B, means that when the company acquires something from a person not doing business, in that manner, the company is required to prepare self-bill e-invoice. So this is the thing you need to be take care. Another thing is we're going to say that as long you are the associations, your body of person means that a human being, if you are doing as a branch, business trust, cooperative society, corporations, company, LLP, partnership, property trust fund, property trust, real estate, all these entities is required to comply with the e-invoice. When the e-invoice going to implement, all of these entity, they are required to comply it. So same go to yours. If you are running as a sole proprietor enterprise, you need to comply for the e-invoice. But you are not doing business. You are like a normal people. I just running as agent, as individual. I'm not doing that business. It's a individual person. Then you don't need to go for the e-invoice implementations. So this what you need can be classified, can be understand yourself through how you're going to do the tax submission. If you are using a form B for the tax submission, you already understand you are doing business. Then you are using a form B. Your tax submission will be due on June. Then if you are not doing that manner, you are running like a normal agents, then you are going like a normal people's, submit the tax return form BE. Then it will be due in the month of April. So this is the difference you can easily understand. So beyond that, there still have the entities, they can be have a exemption to implement e-invoice. So normally it starts from A to L. This one I don't need to explain very clear. As long as you understand, first thing, government, you don't need to implement the e-invoice. Second thing, Agong, Sultan, they don't need to involve. So there is the two parts, or cover most of the last one is the people who not conducting business. So for example, you bought a car to your wife. He is just a housewife. In the coming future, he's going to sell the car. Is it considered doing business? Not really. Because he just a single transaction. He are not trading of the car. So it's not considered conducting a business. So he don't need to implement the e-invoice. So there is a person who is not conducting business. But for example, you as an agent, you are doing business. You have a buy and sell to your customer. You buy from Hi-O, you buy from Shajida and sell it to your customer. Then you are doing business. So when you're selling the car, same things, your personal asset, you're selling to someone or selling to a person doing business, you are required to prepare e-invoice on this transaction. You cannot escape. Why cannot escape is, as long as a person doing business, they bought something from an individual. If the individual didn't issue an e-invoice, the company will be prepared the sell bill e-invoice. In that times, your system, my invoice portal, will be pulled up. There is a transaction or selling the asset. So this thing you need to be take care. So sometimes you bought a lot of the properties, you rent it out to the individual, to the student. You thought that I don't need to declare, but you don't know, you were not aware. Those is actually rent by the company. They sponsor to the student. They give a scholarship to the student as an allowance. Then in that sense, the company will show out the details of your rental income in your My Invoice portal. So when the times you need to pay the tax already, it's no longer like the previous. You just didn't declare it, consider safe. But in future, in this kind of the transactions, actually you'll be kept under the under report income. So this part you need to be take care. Then there's another 5 types transactions expenses is not required to prepare e-invoice. First, we talk about the employment income. Second is on the pension. Third, alimony. Fourth is a distribution of dividend. This distribution of dividend, there's a lot of types. If you are like a REITs company, you are like a public mutual companies, or you have a mutual fund declarations, that one, you need to prepare the e-invoice. But if you're like a listed co, you given dividend to your all the shareholders, that one you don't need to prepare sell bill e-invoice because that is not considered as expenses to the company. So you don't need. So the last one is regarding zakat. Zakat also don't need to prepare e-invoice. So, okay, this is an example like just now we talked about. B to G. When you are the pharmaceutical factory, is selling the medicines to the government hospital, you are required to issue e-invoice. It's to proof of the income. So this is the transaction you need to be take care. Then it's also used to support your income tax purpose. These are the things. But when you go into hospital, your staff go to hospital to get the medicine. Hospital giving you the medicines, and then in the same time, they will be charge you for like 1 ringgit, 10 ringgit. You just give a receipt. In this transaction, don't need to prepare self-bill e-invoice because the receipt can be used to proof of expenses. This is a special treatment given under the e-invoice era. So the company does not require to issue self-bill invoice to support it as expenses. So now we're going to the e-invoice implementation timeline. Actually, now already 90s company under the pilot program, they already started the e-invoice. It starts from the 1st of May. So second category on the phase 1 is for those have a turnover above 100 millions. Will be start on the 1st of August. So the coming August later, you will see that like HIO, they're going to prepare for the e-invoice. The phase 2 is for those have a turnover between 25 million up to 100 million. In this stage, they're going to start on next year, 1st January. So as you are all the agent or distributor, I believe you didn't reach for the 25 millions. So you are going to the phase 3. You need to start implement e-invoice on next year, 1st July. So for all of you going to implement the e-invoice, first thing, you understand you're going to start on the 1st July 2025. So when you're going to register for the account, that is very important. You don't register at the last minute. Because if you register at the last minute, the system down, you cannot get your ID and the password. So you're supposed to register earlier to inform that I need the client ID and the password. It's go for the clicks my invoice email. So you can send to them and request your user ID and the password. That's for registration e-invoice. So how are you going to determine the revenue? There's two types. One is based on your auditor report. For those agent or distributor, you're having a company to running the business. When you have an auditor reports, it will be based on that. If you don't have the auditor reports, the another document going to refer is your tax return form. So you need to look at your tax return form. So to determine the total annual revenues is based on the 12 month in the year 2022. So how to define the year 2022? Then we will look at that later. So like just now we talked about the timeline. You will be have 100 million, 25 million to 100 millions, and the rest of the people doing business, they're going to register. But for 2022, you reach for 100 million. 2023, you didn't reach. Are you going to register earlier? Based on our understanding, not supposed, but we will be recommend you go to register earlier. Because according to the guideline, they say that is 2022. But a lot of people, for those 2023, they didn't reach, they also register. Then this is the sample. So when you're looking at your audited account for the year 2022, but your accounting period is start from 1st of July 2021 up to 31st of December 2022. There's 18 months period. And your annual sales value is 144 millions. So are you going to implement for 1st August this year? Not really. You're supposed to prorate it out. you only calculate the 12-month periods. So if you do the calculations for the prorating, your revenue only 96 million. Then you implement it start from the 1st July 2025. So you still have a time to prepare. So for those individuals, how they're going to know that they are turnover? You're going to look like this example. Sim is a sole provider. He don't have an audited accounts. So the reference document will be based on the tax return form. You look go for your form B, the year 2022. Then you look at the sales turnover. Sales turnover over here got 200,000. So if your turnover 200,000, then you're going to implement is on next year, 1st July 2025. So this thing you need to be take care. So now we're looking at how is the e-invoice works. Actually, there is only 6 steps. Actually, same things go to you as agent or distributor. How is your clients come to you to buy the things? How are you going to have the transactions? The e-invoice only give a detailed transaction in between when you receive an order and then the e-invoice issue out to the customer. That's the difference only. But most of the time you'll be understanding, I'm an agent. I have people come over to my place to buy the things. Then they come over, I issue invoice to them. They consider invoice. That one is a normal invoice practice. But for e-invoice, it will be different. E-invoice is practicing using a tool for 2 things. Either you go to my invoice portal, another one is using our accounting software with the API system. So you can through that to issue the e-invoice. When you prepare the e-invoice, the data, like just now we mentioned, the XML or JSON file, you send to the IRB cloud. You send to the IRB data center. So the IRB will do the validation of the e-invoice. In this time, you'll be receive a notifications. It's go to the buyer and the supplier, which means will be go to you and your customer. You'll receive a notification on the validate e-invoice. So when in that times, you need to let the clients know. You show them this is your e-invoice. You can use the QR code to scan it, and then it will appear an e-invoice template. So from there, the client can be choose whether they can accept your e-invoice or they can do the rejections. So I will allow the buyer to do the e-invoice for the rejections. If they feel out, hey, you send me the e-invoice, the item already wrong. I only might buy 5 items, you charge me 10 items. I want to reject. Yes, this is allowed. As long the buyer can be rejected within 72 hours. If you didn't press for the button to accept the e-invoice, the buyer is allowed to reject the e-invoice within 72 hours. So when you click on the reject, the supplier will be taking up the notification, the buyer reject of the transactions. So that's the things when you're going to liaise with clients, same goes to you. So after this, all the things done, you can go for my invoice portal to trace back the previous transactions. Means that anytime you also can be see that when you sell the item to your clients inside the my invoice portal. Just now we mentioned you got 2 types. One is go for my invoice portal to issue e-invoice. You also can be using your accounting software through the API to issue e-invoice. But when you want to trace back all the records, you only can go back to my invoice portal to check the previous records. Because my invoice portal actually is linked with the IRB data center. So they are keep all your previous transactions. So you can search the previous record and retrieve all the e-invoice. The e-invoice not only on your income, also including all your expenses. If you request an e-invoice from your clients, you request an e-invoice for your supplier, you also can have the e-invoice inside the portal. So over here, got one candidate asking, as a SHOM agent, this is only applicable if a buyer require an invoice or receipt. Yes, correct. For SHOM, your agent's agent customer usually is considered end consumer. You still can be issue a normal invoice or a receipt to them to proof of their transactions. But if they are requesting e-invoice, you need to able to provide. There's two types you can provide to them on the e-invoice. Otherwise, you didn't provide invoice, consider wrongdoing of the things. So now we look at the mechanism. So my e-invoice, you can using a my invoice portal, and then most of the time we are recommend for the taxpayer. Even though you don't have accounting software, you also can be issued the e-invoice because my invoice portal is allow you to do so. Then for those people using my invoice portal, is on not many transactions. They don't need to issue a lot of the tax invoice. Then you're using a my invoice portal. For those have the accounting software, we will be recommend you to using an API. We call it application programming interface, which means it's integrate your accounting systems data to the RV data. So from there, as long you have a lot of transactions, for those is running open shop as a retailer on your POS system, try to using API because a lot of the transaction will be going to issue to your customer. Same thing, if you have the API accounting software already, doesn't mean that each of the transactions is required e-invoice. If you are dealing to the end consumer, then you only request to issue e-invoice upon they request. If they didn't request for the e-invoice, you are not required to issue them the e-invoice. You can issue a normal invoice to them. So this is 55 required field for the e-invoice. This one, later yours can be read by yourself. But one thing I want to highlight is this. Supplier MSIC code and the business activity description. This one is very important because when you issue an invoice, you need to have this. Then where you're going to retrieve this info is go back to your tax returns. So you look at this example, the Muslim trading, they are using 47213 retail sales of dairy products. 47213 is their MSIC code. So this is the MSIC code for Muslim. So when you're doing your personal tax return, you indicate your business code or not? You need to check. So the type of business activity, same thing. This information is going to appear in your e-invoice. So inside the e-invoice got 55 required field to be filling up, but you only require to request 6 informations. This announcement only coming in last today because it's been raised by the 1YB Dato to the IB. Since there is 55 required field, is that all the retailer going to request all the buyer to provide? IB already confirmed, say that it's not necessary. They only require to request 6 category. But which 6 category, we don't know yet. The later announcement will be explained to yours. So another question is say that over here, if we buy from SHOM, all our purchase will be recorded via IRB e-invoice as well. Yes, as long you buy from SHOM, all the transactions from SHOM will be have an e-invoice. And then for those individual not doing business, you get a commission from SHOM. You also will have an e-invoice as well, even though you receive the money. So there's another 12 additional category. This one is talking about for those have a shipping, different address. Another one is import-export. This one you can read by yourself. Then, okay, over here, this is an example for the e-invoice. This e-invoice is from the global telco. For the person buying a smartphone from telco, then there's one category is very important, is classifications. So for yours doing the e-invoice, you need to take care. The classifications must be correct. Last time in the old GST era, you have a lot of the tax code. Now e-invoice era, you have a lot of the classification codes. As per today, there is 45. Previously, there is 40 classification code. Now they have additional 5. So this is the thing you need to be take care. Even though SHOM high-O, yours also need to be take care. Which classification code is going to be practiced on your transaction? Are you going to using a self-bill? Are you going to using a normal invoice? Are you going to sell for the products? What kind of the products? You also need to look at the things. That's total 45. And then most of the time, you are practicing only one. On the sales is others, 0 to 2. As long you cannot find your category inside this 45, then you're using 22. That's the simple. So another things I want to highlight is on the classification code on 045. Non-monetary payments to agent, dealer, and distributor. This thing yet confirm one. Because as what we understand, as long there is a transaction of the business to prove income, then only have this self-bill. So there is not necessary to have 045. So we are still waiting for the further explanation on this. So over here got one question is asking, if a SHOM agent is still submitting Form BE, they are not subject to e-invoice. Only B form submissions is subject to the e-invoice. As my understanding, if you're submitting Form BE, means that you are not doing business. Not doing business, no need to implement e-invoice. But if you have a Form B, then it's 100% confirmed you need to practicing e-invoice. BE, not necessarily say that you don't need to implement. Just trying to explain to you, Form BE, you are not doing business, you don't need to prepare e-invoice. But if you still submitting Form BE, in the same time, you also practicing business. That same thing, you also need to implement the e-invoice. E-invoice is for those doing business. But for those Form B is 100%, you need to practicing e-invoice. So another category is regarding the coding is on the frequency billing and the invoice type. E-invoice type previously only got 5 types. 4 documents, like just now we mentioned. One is the self-bill e-invoice. This is only 5 types. Recently, they increased another 3. Self-bill credit note, self-bill debit note, self-bill refund note. Why they will have this is because we also highlight to RV, say that why self-bill don't have a credit note? Why self-bill don't have the debit note? If the transaction in this scenario, what will be happen? So that's why they come up these 3 new codes. So this is an example for the My Invoice transaction. We still have 20 minutes. So I still got around 20 slides. So I'll be cut short to explain to you, because later we will go one more clearer how you're going to issue an e-invoice. So in cut short, if you are using a My Invoice portal, you issue out the e-invoice, the data to an IRB cloud. IRB will be return the validations on the e-invoice. In this time, the supplier and the buyer will receive a notifications. So supplier, SHOM, you have to share the e-invoice QR code to your buyer, to your customer, or to your agents. Say that this is the e-invoice. Ask them to check. They can be choose for accept. They also can be choose for rejections. If they reject, then the reject notification will be go to you. Same times will be go to them. If no rejections or consider accept, then the data will be sorting go for the RB database. So which means the RB will be capture these transactions. In the later, you're going to do the tax return, the times it will be pulled up. So every time you also need to check, is that your income correct or not? So you need to check your accounting records with the RB My Invoice Portal System data. So another types of people are doing using an API. API same things. It's just through using a software through an API to link with the RB. So the process will be same. Then for those transactions involve foreign currency, you are allowed to use your internal, or you are allowed to use a bank records. You're also allowed to use the custom transaction rates. So this is on the foreign currency. You can read by yourself. Okay, over here, we're going to try to explain how is e-invoice work. So when a customer come to your shop, request, I buy these items, I bought already. I need e-invoice or not. If the buyer requests for the e-invoice, the buyer need to provide you the information. So the information, most of the time, we already request two things: IC numbers or the TIN numbers. This is under the explanation given by the IRB. But latest announcement, they say that you need to request 6. So this one will be updated later again. When the buyer gives you the information, supplier, SHOM, or you as agent, you need to start to prepare the e-invoice. You prepare the e-invoice, everything's done already, it will be sent to the RB database, RB cloud. They will send a notification to yours to say that, oh, this is the e-invoice. You can share the QR code to your customer. So if everything's okay, then the customer click on accept of the e-invoice, the things will be captured inside the RB database. So the whole transaction is considered complete. And then the e-invoice can be used to substantiate of the expenses. So if the buyer come in, they already bought this item, they didn't request for the e-invoice. In these circumstances, you can just prepare a normal invoice, just a handwriting to them, an invoice. So this can be accepted by the buyer, but the buyer still receives the rights up to a month. As long within that month, for example, today they come to buy the items, they didn't request for the e-invoice, I didn't issue the invoice to them, they still allowed to request the invoice up to end of this month. So if they didn't come over, then in this time, we are preparing the consolidated e-invoice. I will console all the normal invoice, which is not issue the e-invoice, and then do the submission to the RB. This one got limitations, cannot more than 25 megabytes data, or cannot more than 100 transactions. So in details, this one I will explain later. So for those come over, for example, just now, they come over another 2 days to request invoice. They also need to provide you 2 things, the IC and the numbers. So for those didn't request for the invoice, and then when you prepare the consolidated e-invoice, you are using the information as a general public. And then the buyer data, you just put not applicable. So for consolidated e-invoice, you are preparing based on monthly basis. You have 7 days after the month end to do the submissions on the consolidated. So this is an example for consolidated e-invoice. If you only have one outlet, then I recommend you to practice this. All the e-invoice, invoice number, just put over there with the total amount. If it is involved for the service tax, you need to indicate. If didn't have the service tax, you just ignore it. Then let's say you have a 2 branch. You have a Penang branch, KL branch. All the receipt, all the invoice you issue out, the number you can split into 2 branches to present it like this. This is, we call it the consolidated e-invoice. You look at the buyer names, it's a general public. So the rest of the information just put as a not applicable. Okay, for those transactions cannot using normal invoice, only got 7. First, automotive, when you go have a buy car or sell car, their industry, they cannot use the automotive, cannot go for the consolidated invoice, means that they cannot issue you a normal invoice. Second is for those buying etiquette business, cannot using normal invoice. Third is a luxury good and jewelry. This one, they got a lenient a bit, they allowed to do consolidate. Recently updates. Fourth is on the constructions. Fifth is on the wholesales. Wholesales on the construction material. Sixth is gambling and betting. These 6 items actually didn't involve yours. But for those doing business, when you have a buy car, buy things, buy etiquette, you need to remember, definitely you will be have an e-invoice. Means that you are request the supplier to provide you the e-invoice under the company names. So this thing you need to be take care. And then the last one is a payment to agents. Payment made to agents cannot use normal invoice. All must be e-invoice. So this is related the SHOM Hari Raya category, but yours is not involved. You can be allowed to issue e-invoice to SHOM or Hari Raya, but Hari Raya or SHOM, they cannot practicing self-bill e-invoice if you already issue an e-invoice. If you didn't issue e-invoice, they will be practicing self-bill e-invoice. Okay, another thing is calling statement of bill. If you have a monthly billing one, like for example, your telephone bill, if you have insurance or your finance charges, like a bank charges, is go by monthly, their statement slowly will become like an e-invoice. This inside their e-invoice, they'll be indicate that the description. Charges, frequency, payment frequency will be go for monthly. Classifications like telephone bill will be have their own classifications. Description, they will be just say that telephone bill for which month and then how much. That one will consider as your e-invoice. Then insurance, those things, they also same things will be prepared for the e-invoice to yours. So when you have an insurance, you need to be take care. You need to request the e-invoice from the insurance company to prove on your tax relief in coming future. So for those got hiring staff one, hiring staff, all the claims made by the staff is not required issue under company name. It's not a must, but it's a recommend. If the staff able to request the supplier issue under the employer name, is the best practice. So this one you can be study on yourself. So okay, for self-bill invoice, for those is not doing business, is an individual. Like for the first one, payment to agents. Agent didn't issue e-invoice to the SHOM. Agent didn't issue e-invoice to the Shahajida. So under the SHOM level category, they are required to prepare a self-bill invoice. When you, as an agent or distributor, you are doing business, then you need to issue e-invoice them to SHOM, to Hari Raya. Then they are not required to prepare self-bill e-invoice in this manner. So the second one is related to the service or good rendered by the foreign supplier. So when you have buy something from overseas or you have a service from the overseas, for example, Netflix, Facebook advertisement, Google Space, you need to prepare the self-bill e-invoice to proof of these expenses. The third one is a profit distributions. Profit distributions don't need to prepare on the self-bill e-invoice in the circumstance you are declaring the company listed co and non-listed dividend. But for those mutual fund REITs agency, when they declare of the profit distributions, they need to issue self-bill e-invoice. The fourth one is on the e-commerce. E-commerce, yours are not involving, so I'm not going to further. The fifth one is on betting and gambling, also not involved. The sixth one is related to you. For those you acquire something from an individual not doing business, like just now I mentioned, your wife selling the car, she is not doing business, but the buyer is required to prepare self-bill e-invoice. Same goes to you. You bought a computer for your relative. They are not doing business. You need to do a self-bill invoice if you are doing business. If you don't have prepared self-bill invoice, in coming future, IRB will not allow you to claim for the expenses. So this thing, you need to be taken care. Okay, this is an example for those transactions involve payment monetary to the agent, dealer, and distributor. So current flow is supplier pay the commission to the agent and dealer. Agent and dealer sell the good or service to the buyer. So if you look at the categories, purchasers acquire goods or service from seller is through the agent. In that manner, the agent still allowed to preparing a normal invoice. But if the agent want to collect the commissions at that times, agent, if they are doing business, they are required to issue e-invoice to the supplier. If the agent is not doing business, it's like a normal agent running the business on behalf of the supplier, then they no need to prepare the e-invoice. In that manner, the supplier is required to prepare self-bill e-invoice. So this is an example for those. If you are is under the position of SHOM or Sajida or Hayoraya, when you prepare a self-bill e-invoice, you need to choose the classifications 035 self-bill e-invoice under the payment to the agents. Agents is a supplier. Agent is not the buyer. Buyer is your positions. So you need to prepare this self-bill e-invoice with the descriptions of the agent commission going to pay. So this is an example for self-bill e-invoice provide to the agent. So for those having a profit distributions under the category, when the company giving up the dividends on the trust investment, then the public mutual company like yours is required to prepare a self-bill e-invoice to prove of the distribution of the dividend or the profits. This is an example. ABC invests in the public mutual funds for the unit trust. So under the public mutual funds, when they declare the dividend, they are required to issue a self-bill e-invoice to prove on these expenses. This is the things public mutual need to do. So as an individual or the supplier ABC, don't need to prepare anything. When the self-bill invoice is prepared by the public mutual, ABC company, they will report up the records. There is income given from the public mutual. So this transaction don't need to issue e-invoice. So like just now, we already mentioned a lot of things under the e-invoice. In short, as a summary, if you are not practicing simple things, there is a penalty up from 200 up to 20,000, including the imprisonment. But so far until today, imprisonment case is hardly happened. But for the penalty, it's very frequent. As long as you're not practicing or you failure to practice on the e-invoice, then you need to take care on the penalty from 200 to 20,000. So what will be impact to the business after e-invoice implementation? This is the parts for those doing business one. In previous times, for example, SHOM has implemented e-invoice in 1st of August 2024. You as agent, you implement is on 1st July 2025. Are you going to issue e-invoice to them before 1st of July? It's not really. You're still allowed to issue normal e-invoice. But SHOM is not required to issue self-billed e-invoice. No longer required. This amendment is on the last February 2024. If you refer for the last year guideline, SHOM is required to prepare self-billed e-invoice. They will do the changes on this part. Even though SHOM receive a normal invoice, they still allowed to claim for the tax deductions. But for those transactions after 1st of July, as you as an agent, you are required to issue the e-invoice to them. Otherwise, you cannot prove of your income. So this thing you need to be take care. So under the transition period, 1st of August up to 1st of July 2025, normal invoice debit note, credit note still can be acceptable for the justification of the income and the expenses. But after 1st of July 2025, all the expenses is not allowed to claim if they still receive a normal invoice, unless you are preparing self-billed e-invoice. So beyond that, e-invoice also will have an impact on the importer service tax and also withholding tax. For details, I will be explained to those doing business. For me, a bit difficult because of time constraint. Importer service tax, why will be affected is because when you issue the e-invoice, in the same time, you need to do the declaration importer service tax in the coming months. Same go to the withholding tax. This is the thing will be impact for those agents. They have import the services from overseas. For example, advertisement of the Facebook. For example, you bought Netflix subscriptions for your retail shops. So in that category, you need to be take care on this part. When you have a self-billed e-invoice, you need to declare the imported service tax. Same thing go for the withholding tax within the time frame. Then how you're going to prepare for the e-invoice? Usually will be split into 3 categories. One is on the preparations. How to prepare? Try to attend as much as the invoice costs. Try to review your existing the accounting software. Do they allow you to input the 55 field data fields and then identify all the transactions, how it works? Is that I going to issue an invoice? Is I going to issue a self-billed invoice? Or the supplier will be providing the invoice? This thing you need to be understand. So when you get a preparation done, you can have a testing. The software further come over to install the API to you. Then you can test run the records. Then the last step is go live. When everything is done, complete, no issue, then you can go live to your system on the e-invoice. So for the e-invoice practicing, there's a 3 benefit given by the government. First is digitalization grant. Digitalization grant is when you have changed your accounting software, when you have a post system, go for e-invoice, you can apply for digitalization grant. But this one is depend on your supplier. Second, for the capital allowance. Last time, for all the costs incurred on the software, you are claimed within 4 years. Now, they reduce to 3 years or 2 years. So this is the changes to the capital allowance. Then the last part is for the tax deduction. The maximum claim can be up to 50,000 because of the EIG related expenditure, including the e-invoice implementations. So these are the things benefit on the e-invoice for those doing business. So that is my sharings. Do you have any questions? You can ask over here, put in the chat box. Okay, the first question, kalau macam kita ini apa cerita? Kita beli barang daripada SHOM, tapi bonus juga daripada sales team. So, awak kena faham, sama ada beli barang dengan SHOM, subsequent awak dah jual bagi awak punya customer tak? Kalau awak dah beli dan jual, awak doing business. So, bila awak doing business, awak kena issue e-invoice to your customer. Same thing, you also can be issue e-invoice to SHOM. Second, must account for proof of purchase to be able to claim as business expenses. E-invoice, you need to prepare the e-invoice, even though you also need to request for the e-invoice. This is to prove your income, to prove all your expenses. Without the e-invoice or sale bill e-invoice, you are not allowed to claim for the tax deduction. For SHOM agent, we have purchase of goods from SHOM, expenses and sales commissions, self-bill income. Okay, that's two types. If you have a purchase goods from SHOM, SHOM will give you an e-invoice. Then subsequent, are you going to sell to your customer? If you are selling to customer, you need to prepare e-invoice to the customer. So for the sales commissions, it can be two types. It can be go for SHOM, issue a self-bill, and then same thing, you also need to request to issue an e-invoice. So lagi ada apa-apa question nak tanya tak?
Mr. Yun,
Yes.
malah tanya, dia punya sistem ni tak tahu lah sebab IO tak tahu lah IO dah start buat ke belum kan. Kau dapat example pada SHOM lagi mudah faham kan. Tapi secara in general dia lebih kurang macam GST dulu
Dia tak.
Okay. GST dulu kan. Take invoice tu sebab kita punya sistem ni multi level kan. So dia punya kita tak jual kepada customer pun, kita je orang tengah tu lah. Receipt terus ke agent, ke distributor, ke customer. Dulu tax invoice SHOM yang keluarkan. Tapi kita punya bonus tu dia panggil self bill invoice lah. Masa zaman tu ada juga self bill invoice yang dikeluarkan oleh SHOM lah untuk komisen bulan-bulan tu lah. Rasa sama lebih kurang lah.
Lebih kurang. Tapi untuk e-invoice dia beza dengan GST. GST boleh ada masa untuk buat amendments. Tapi e-invoice tak ada masa untuk buat amendments. Dia live macam 24 hours online nya. So bila dia prepare invoice, everything should be go for online.
Sebenarnya tak tahu sebenarnya apa. Kadang bila tengok tu macam tadi USP macam menakutkan kan. Jadi kita sebenarnya kita ni agentnya bukan. Sebenarnya apa kita perlu buat sebenarnya kan. Sebab benda yang saya faham tak ada benda ni. Kita just semua SHOM buat sebenarnya kan. Kita just tunggu je kan. Maksudnya kita dapat receipt.
Jadi awak case awak kena tengok sama awak beli dengan SHOM, subsequent awak dah jual tak. Kalau awak dah jual, awak consider doing business, awak trading. Awak beli dan jual. Kalau awak semua barang jual daripada SHOM dan awak collect commission atau bonus daripada SHOM, itu tak perlu. Itu tak ada for another e-invoice era. Pasal awak tak ada doing business. Kalau awak dah beli dan jual bagi customer, itu consider doing business. Jadi awak kena prepare untuk e-invoice.
Okay. Tapi sebenarnya kita sebagai DN ni macam set invoice kita perlu register tak? Kata macam tadi yang in case kita memang tak doing business lah. Kita perlu register juga tak?
Kalau tak doing business tak perlu.
Tak perlu Okay. Sebenarnya berapa lama katakan invoice tu kena approval by apa ni panggil lembaga hasil kan. Sebenarnya katakan penjualan kita dapat automatik ke?
Dia bukan automatik. Bila awak request based on kita punya experience, sekarang dia pakai lebih kurang 1 minggu lebih. Pasal dia kena check punya kriteria. Tapi bila next year, when semua orang kena automatic, itu kita tak tahu lagi. Pasal dia punya sistem mungkin akan ubah. Pasal bila next year, lebih kurang ada 1 juta lebih company akan register. Jadi bila masa itu, kita takut dia punya sistem tak boleh comply. Jadi mereka mungkin akan bagi automatic blanket approval. Pada masa kini, semua apply through the email. Jadi email mereka hantar itu user ID dan password. Okay, sini ada question berkenaan. So for individual e-filing, we consider our income as commission. But if we need to create e-invoice, LHDM will consider additional income to us, right? Yes, correct. When now you're doing the e-filing, all your income is considered commissions because you don't have sell the products. But in future, let's say SHOM got sell product to you, and then subsequent you got sell it to your customer, then that one will become your additional income. Go for the business. Another soalan, if our customer don't even care us for receipt or invoice, then I still consider not business kan. Kalau tidak kena tangkap bagi Abi, consider not business lah. Kalau tanya betul-betul, also consider doing business. Jadi kena register loh. So, any lagi ada apa-apa soalan?
Apa ni, Mr. Agent? Kalau kita buat tu tax e-filing, kita buat apa ni income statement kan, profit and loss. Maksud dia next nanti dia punya expenses tu mesti semua ada invoice lah. Contoh kita beli dekat hardware kan, kedai hardware dapat isi tulis tangan kan. Tu consider lepas 1/7/25 tu consider tak diterima ke macam mana? Perlu e-invoice betul lah. Macam GST dulu tax tu kan.
Ya, betul. Kalau ada e-invoice itu expenses tak boleh claim for cukai. Not tax deductible.
Okey, Pahala kau macam GST dulu jugalah kan. Dia kena ada GST tu. Tax invoice lah. Okey, faham.
So, any other questions?
I nak tanya, when you say July 2025, it's a blanket or macam auto apa? Semua akan kena, all taxpayers will be in the e-invoice kan? You still mean it's for borang B submission only kan?
Okay. In short, for those people do the filing using Form BE, you declare your own self not doing business. Correct?
Okay.
So you're doing using BE. But this statement is not really correct because you didn't declare the business income. You also can using Form BE. Correct?
Correct.
So for those BE one, you need to justify your own self. Are you doing business or not? If you're doing a business, you need to register. For those using Form B, you very clear that you are doing business. So you are doing business, definitely you need to register for e-invoice.
Okay. I mean, I'm just asking for the sake of those who are, have very small commissions from SHOM. So, perhaps they are just declaring commissions in their BE, as part of their, as a second income, not as a borang B taxpayer lah.
So for those collect small commission only, they didn't have doing a trading on high-O products, then it's not considered doing business.
Okay, thank you.
So one thing you also need to be take care, if you are doing business, not looking at the amount already, you go to the roadside, jalan tepi gerai, semua mereka kena pakai e-invoice. Jadi bagaimana mereka akan handle Touch and Go, Shopee, mereka sistem akan tolong mereka lah. Jadi in coming future, as long you are doing business, you need to get ready on e-invoice.